Well, Lisl, we're going to talk a bit about the history of things today, but before we get into that, maybe you could say something about what you're doing just now and what current work you're involved in?
The timing of that question is very apposite because I've just got a new contract. I started the Bayswater Institute, I'm horrified to realise, almost 20 years ago. I was director for the first few years, but we've now got a new director, and yesterday I got a contract from him, which is the model of an employment contract. Right. I can work when I like, where I like, and get 20,000 a year.
Sounds pretty good to
How's
me.
That? I'll be working at home more because I've got mobility problems, but I am working.
Uh-huh. And what other things are going on at the moment?
We just lost a project and gained a project.
Mm-hmm.
The one we gained is locally here to do with GP practice.
Right.
And to what extent patients register with GPs these days, right, or not, and to what extent they go straight to A&E and what problems that creates. Mm-hmm. We've done a lot of stuff in the health service.
Well, that's the present, so clearly still active and engaged and working. But how did all this start? How did this work? How did you get to where you are today?
As you know, I've just finished writing an autobiography, and I'm afraid that makes the story perhaps a bit more logical and tidy than it really was, because I've had to formulate it so I can come out with pat answers. I hope I won't, but there have been a lot of different influences, some of them individuals and some of them circumstances. And the first of the individuals was an aunt who, in pre-war Czechoslovakia, which is where we came from, was a member of parliament. She was a passionate socialist. She'd grown up in, before the First World War, what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and was horrified by working conditions, unemployment, poverty. Dickensian situation, only there wasn't a Dickens to popularise it. And so she became a socialist, she became a member of parliament after the war. She represented Czechoslovakia in the International Labour Office, I think. And she had enormous influence on me as a child. She was an academic, but she produced one book with a colleague. It's called, in English, Memorial to the Unknown Woman Worker.
All right.
And the colleague was called Klein, and she collected stories of women and their families and their histories. And he put them in historical, economic context. And I think if the house burns down, that's the only thing I would want to save. For instance, a 4-year-old is told that if she works hard at the lace making, she can have maize gruel to eat instead of maize soup, because the gruel has more kernels in it than the soup.
Goodness.
You know, it's as basic as that.
Yeah, yeah.
I sometimes wonder how she would feel about what I'm doing now, because methodologies of organisation, diagnosis and development are a bit remote from that. And I occasionally get a twinge of guilt that it's not as close to the reality of people's lives as that part of me might have expected. But I don't apologise for it. I think it's important, and I think it's the precondition for the realities. Now, she escaped to England in 1939, helped by some colleagues in the British Labour Party. And that was a few months after my parents and I came at the end of 1938. So as an adolescent in this country, I would sit at the edge of political discussions. You know, fellow émigrés would cluster around her for coffee on a Sunday afternoon.
Right.
And I would be there drinking this in. And it wasn't just politics, it was stories from home and family stories. And I thought afterwards, I certainly didn't think like that at the time, that this was how my roots got nourished somehow. But when I grew up, when I was sort of adult in the working world, situation has changed. The the debates here in the 1950s were about public ownership, nationalisation. And there were industries that were nationalised, later denationalised, I think in some cases later renationalised, and I think there's even one that's re-denationalised, I'm not sure. And what struck me was that the working experience of the people in those industries, it was at that time, I mean, wider organisations than that now, was not very different according to who owned it.
Oh.
If you're on a short cycle, repetitive, machine-paced job under public ownership, you'll be in the same job under private ownership. And whatever the political arguments are for public-private, on the whole, it doesn't make much difference to the direct experience.
Were there other influences apart from Fanny?
Oh, lots. Perhaps the next most relevant one is my own early work experience. I'm a little bit embarrassed because I've written about this, and I hope I don't get too boringly repetitive, but it was kind of an important turning point. I got a degree in languages on the assumption that I would probably teach, and on the assumption that we would probably go home after the war. I had good English, so I thought I'd probably be teaching English. I didn't give it too much thought. By the time I left college, it was clear that we were not going back. And I didn't know what to do. The University Appointments Board was not much help. I remember asking this woman, well, I'd quite like to be a journalist. And she said, how do you think you can be a journalist if you haven't got experience? And I can't remember whether I said, how am I going to experience if I don't get a job? I hope I said it, but I can't remember. But they circulated vacancies, and I just applied for the first one I got. I must have been very intimidated. I know I was. I was very timid. And didn't wait to have any choices, didn't wait for more than one. Just got the first job they sent. And it was as assistant to the information officer of a library organisation, to which I'm totally unsuited. I was bored and miserable. It didn't occur to me that you can change jobs. I know that sounds peculiar. I'm a fairly autonomous kind of person now, but it didn't occur to me. It led to another library job in the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which I thought might be more interesting, but it was writing catalogue cards. No connection with the books or with the scholars or with the work of the institute. And I started getting mysterious temperatures. It was a very unpleasant, difficult period. Temperatures to which nobody could find a reason. And once I ran a temperature for so long that they wrote and said they were sorry they couldn't keep the job open any longer. And then I got better. Surprise, surprise. I mean, I know about psychosomatic symptoms now, but I knew nothing of that kind of thing then. So I went to the local labour exchange and asked for a part-time job. And they sent me part-time to see if I was okay and to leave time for interviews for proper jobs.
Right.
And they sent me to a little local factory on the river at Hammersmith, where they made B-Max and vitamin pills. And I started to enjoy myself.
Right.
Some of the time I was stuffing envelopes with advertising material, and some of the time I was packing pills. And it was fun. You'd learnt the job in 10 minutes, and after that you just gossiped all day. And the gossip was the same as in university. Different language perhaps, but same topics, men, politics, families, you know. And there was something else. Once a month, this made a huge impression on me. Once a month, they had a day of induction for anybody who'd been new that month, from the chief accountant down to the lowliest factory hand. And it was completely fascinating. Heads of departments came to explain what they did and what their departments did. We had a tour of the plant, and the manufacturing process was explained. Now, they bought wheat from Rankovis, which came up the river in barges. The first process was to extract the kernel of the wheat, which is what they made BMAX from. What was left after that, they pressed to get an oil which it said was rich in vitamin E, which went into capsules. And what was left after that, they sold to Heinz for thickening soups.
Right.
What I don't remember is whether they sold, I think they sold it for more than they'd paid for the original wheat, but I'm not sure about that.
Right. Good business.
And I was totally fascinated. It was so interesting. And that, I think, I don't want to romanticise this, but it's laid the seeds for the twin interests of work satisfaction and organisation.
Quite a contrast between the two worlds, the library world and the pill world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then I knew what I wanted to do. I had a compulsion about job satisfaction. I thought it was desperately important that people should be in jobs that suit them.
Right.
I wasn't at that time yet interested or aware of the possibility of designing jobs to suit the people. So I trained for personnel management. What that experience left me with was a lifelong love affair with industry. I'm never as happy as when I'm in an organisation, and it doesn't have to be industry, health service, banks, anything, trying to understand how it works, why this fits in with that, and if they do this, this will happen. It's like a detective story, understanding how an organisation works. And the other lifelong legacy is this obsession, I should say, not compulsion, about work satisfaction.
And the political thread, how did that get carried forward?
It got thinner.
Uh-huh.
Got thinner.
You joined the Fabians at that time?
I was in the Fabian Society. I wrote a pamphlet called The Meaning of Work, which the executive at first rejected because it wasn't political enough. And I think it was Shirley Williams who talked them round. She was General Secretary of the Fabians for a time. And the political thread has got much, much thinner and is, at the moment, virtually non-existent.
And what came after working in the pill factory then and going to personnel training? What came after that?
Well, I actually got a job as a personnel officer in a small factory that belonged to Metal Box Company in Bermondsey in South London. And that was fun. I really enjoyed that. But after about 2.5 years, the company closed this factory down. And I thought, well, for a first personnel job, that was probably enough. I think I could happily have gone on in personnel management. But I went to see my tutor. I had done the training at London School of Economics, and the tutor had been Nancy Sear, that you might have heard of.
Baroness Sear?
Later, yes, she became Baroness Sear. She ran the personnel course. And she had just been put on the Human Relations Committee set up by the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research to administer projects of research. We're in the 1950s now, when there was the first ever broad programme of organisational social science research, partly as a result of funding from the Marshall Plan. And it was called the Conditional Aid Programme. The condition was that this government had to put in an equivalent amount of money, I think. And Nancy said, have you ever thought about research? And up till then I hadn't. And she suggested that I go and talk to the man who was administering this programme. Social science was new to them, and they wanted to find out what the issues are about social science, and they thought the way to do that was to have a project in-house. And by sheer chance, someone on that project had recently given in her notice, and I got a job as a junior research assistant on a project called the human implications of work study, which fitted in with what I was about. I had no qualifications, nor did any of the others on that team. It made us very careful about methods, and we read a lot. And one of the guys was in process of having an analysis, which on the one hand made him stare out of the window a lot. On the other hand, he alerted us to things like transference and countertransference and what happens in an interview. It was very valuable. That's where I got my first research experience and training. The other part of that was that one was sitting in the place where a whole wide program was being administered. And one saw all of it. The different researchers came in to discuss their ideas. One saw their reports, one saw their grant applications, one saw the civil servants puzzled about how to deal with the large salaries that people in the Tavistock Institute needed because they had to pay for analysis. And one met the people. And they became lifelong friends in many cases. And it was a range from psychoanalytically informed stuff at one end of the scale. I think part of the Tavistock Institute's coal mining studies was funded in that program.
Right.
Through industrial sociology, Tom Burns, Joan Woodward, social anthropology, Tom Lupton, who wrote a lovely book called On the Shop Floor. He'd done participant observation, just working on the shop floor. Through psychologists to ergonomists at the more scientific and experimental end of the scale. And I have burnt into me that some problems lend themselves to this approach and some lend themselves to that approach. And when I later, much later, became social sciences advisor to ESSO, that's how I handled it. A colleague and I would help departments formulate problems or situations they wanted some work done on. And then one would go out and exactly like that pattern, I realised with hindsight, we had a project, again from the Tavistock Institute, on life and work on board oil tankers. Alan Trist, who was Eric Trist's son, was anthropologically inclined. I can't remember if he was an anthropologist. And he and Simon Badley did this study of a 24-hour community. Also in the marine department, we had ergonomists redesigning the bridge of a small coastal tanker. And they were actually able to go to the launching of a ship that they'd contributed to, which is not the kind of feedback one gets very often. And a study of distribution that was contracted out to sociologists at LSE, to John Deeks. And my assumption is that that's how it is. And I get quite grumpy that nobody else thinks that way. And I hate to admit it, but I've only recently realised, why would they? Nobody else has had that experience.
So a very particular position and view that you got from the DSIR, almost unique really, of British organisational social science research.
Yeah, the problem is that the education system isn't structured that way. You know, people learn this or this or this or this. They don't learn, well, in this situation you try this and in that situation you try that. It is quite difficult to decide whether that was the most enormous stroke of good luck because of the development that it produced and the opportunities and the relationships that came out of it, or whether to some extent it's also bad luck, because with that kind of an attitude you don't belong anywhere. I am a member of the British Sociological Association because if pushed, I suppose I'm a sociologist. Though if you work in a problem-oriented way, you lose touch with your discipline of origin. But when I go to their meetings, I feel quite alien. It's a different world. also, I don't belong to the ISPSO because there's a lot I would have to leave outside, all the contingency theory and the socio-technical stuff that I work with. I would have to leave outside, and I very much like the way they design their annual meeting, where there is a day for members and 2 days for people who are just interested but not necessarily members. I enjoy that.
And what came after the department?
It's not so much that it came after as that it merged. One of the people I got to know in this way who came in was Joan Woodward. The other people on that team left after the end of the fieldwork, and I was left to write it up. And Joan offered to supervise this, and the DSIR were grateful. So I joined her at Imperial College, where she was pioneering a job of teaching social science to engineers. And I finished a little book. I then took a sabbatical and got myself some qualifications at last, and then joined her on the second of her major research projects, which was about behavioural consequences of management control systems. It's not very well known, not as well known as her study of technology and organisation. I think it's actually more important. She was developing contingency theory, and contingency theory has been a huge part of me and remains a huge part of me. In fact, out of that whole range of approaches that I listed, I think the two most important ones are the psychodynamic approach and the contingency approach. And one without the other, I think, is inadequate. Either one without the other is incomplete. And what keeps me going and what keeps me interested still is how do they connect?
I think people will be more familiar with the psychodynamic theory, Lisl. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about what contingency theory is for you, just to help them to get it.
Forgive me if I bristle at the for me. You know, it's not all subjective. There's something out there that's real.
Yes.
And it's about the relationship between structural factors and what happens behaviourally. Where structure influences behaviour, just as in a crude, oversimplified way, the psychodynamic approach is about how behaviour and dynamics influence, if you like, structure. So markets, the size of an organisation, the control systems, the geography, the buildings, all kinds of things influence what happens behaviourally. You pointed out the other day how my situation in the DSIR influenced the dynamics of what happened to me later. That, I would say, is a contingency kind of comment.
Okay. So you're with Joan at Imperial College. What did that lead to?
Both of us were interested in applying research. None of the people who worked in that programme were intending to do purely theoretical stuff, although they actually produced a lot of theory. Application was important, and the conditional aid project had produced some interesting stuff, and industry was beginning to get interested. And Esso Petroleum decided to put a social scientist on their staff in-house to see what a social scientist would produce. And I saw this advertisement by chance on the back of somebody else's newspaper in the Underground one day, and discussed it with Joan, and applied for that job and got it. You remember I said earlier that I wasn't alone in this approach of seeing a lot of types of discipline that were relevant for problems. I think a lot of the people who were working on the conditional aid programme also saw it that way. when I got to SO, Albert Schoens, who was the first secretary of the Social Science Research Council, and I put our heads together to collect the names of people we thought were interested in applied work. And we invited them to a seminar. And they liked it. And they wanted to do it again. And this group of people met about, 2 or 3 times a year for quite a number of years. They insisted on keeping it informal. Mm-hmm. I felt a bit guilty because of other people not involved, and if there's going to be a sort of professional association, one ought to be more democratic, but they absolutely wouldn't let that happen. And it came to be known as Klein's Mates. It was people like some from the Tavistock, Harold Bridger, Eric Miller, Girth Higgin, Michael Foster. I think Hugh Murray came sometimes. And Joan Woodward came, and Tom Lupton came, Sylvia Shimin, Tom Burns. It's amazing now, the sort of roll call.
Yeah. Wow.
And that takes me back a bit to that experience of the conditional aid programme, because some other things happened while I was in the DSIR. For example, being there, I heard about a conference on group relations that the Tavistock Institute was advertising at Leicester University, and I went to that. Very sceptical, came away still very sceptical. I'd been a little bit egged on to do it by Nancy Sear, who was kind of curious and wanted to know. And we had supper afterwards. She said, what happened? What happened? And I tried to explain what happened, and I said, and there was a man called Rice who talked about some work he'd done in India in a weaving shed. And she said, good God, is he still living on that? That was in 1957. It's also the first time I met Harold Bridger. Now, it was a 2-week event, and in the weekend in the middle, they showed that film 12 Angry Men, which people think is frightfully important from a group relations point of view. It's a fiction. It isn't a real group relation situation. I don't think that's right. But anyway, they showed the film, and then Harold did a commentary from group dynamics angle. The trouble was he got some of his facts wrong. He would say, you remember when so-and-so got up and went to the window, and it hadn't been so-and-so, it had been somebody else. And this sort of thing bothers me badly. I protested, and some other people joined me. Afterwards, the staff wrote up an account of this conference, and this so-called mid-term rebellion had some very fanciful interpretations attached to it. So I wrote and explained why it had arisen. And they had the integrity to change the draft. And I didn't see Harold again for a long time after that. But I think somehow the roots of a very deep and very long colleague relationship and friendship were in that mutual integrity. He from his point of view and I from my point of view were showing integrity. I'll jump a bit, because when things were beginning to get difficult in SO, which I guess I'll be talking about, Harold began to work as a consultant to me. And that was because of Klein's Mates. Because I talked about difficulties in Klein's Mates, and that emerged. And when the SO operation wound down, he was one of the people who invited me to join the Tavistock Institute. The other thing that happened at the time of the DSR work, although it wasn't part of the DSR work, was that I met Maria Hoda. I met her through her family, whom I knew, and she became a teacher to me. I mean, she was a brilliant teacher. And remember, I had no qualifications, and she sort of took my social science education in hand a little bit. She took me out to lunch, first time I met her, and I was very excited about this project we were doing and burbled on about it. And she said, "What's the frame of reference?" And I didn't know what that meant. And I had to go back to the office and find out, you know. And once we were going to a conference in Harrogate, and on the train between Leeds and Harrogate, she tried to teach me how to do chi-squared statistics. And it's one of her failures. I still can't do it. And I blame the railways. You know, the distance between Leeds and Harrogate isn't quite long enough. And she was a lifelong friend. And when the Bayswater Institute started, she became one of its founding trustees. And a few years later, she had 2 strokes which robbed her of eyesight, and she wanted to resign from being a trustee because she thought she wouldn't be able to do the job properly. So we quickly invented the role of president. Anyway, she didn't want to do it if it didn't have some meaning. And I said, well, it means that you'll be able to nag from a position of authority. And she said, in that case, I accept.
Very good. Yeah.
And she was president till she died. To return to ESSO, as I said, we developed a series of project activities, really replicating the model that I internalized in the DSIR, with some ergonomics, some psychodynamic work, some sociological work. And I think after a slow start, we began to do reasonably well. And with hindsight, I don't think I gave it enough credit at the time. I think it was a really exciting development. One of the reasons I took that job was that I had been very much influenced by Elliot Jax's The Changing Culture of a Factory. He had been, in this country, the first social scientist taking a job full-time in a company. And it was very exciting, but it was also very idiosyncratic. He was a psychoanalyst, and I didn't think many psychoanalysts would want to take that kind of job, and I didn't think many managing directors would want them to. And if using the social sciences in organisations was going to spread at all, there had to be a more ordinary way of doing it, a less exciting, if you like, guru-like way of doing it. And that's what I was doing, and I'm not ashamed of it. I mean, I think we were on the right track and doing good stuff. And then it got destroyed after, I don't know, 3-4 years, because the parent company sent across a team of OD consultants from the Institute of Social Research, Michigan. And there was a very nasty battle for about 2 years. It was horrible. We were fighting both on territorial grounds and on scientific grounds. And it was never possible to be clear which one you were fighting. They mushed into each other. And in the end, both lost, because on the one hand, the department where they were going to do their project didn't agree to it. And on the other hand, my activity had got weaker. A lot of energy went into this battle. Plus, the employee relations manager who had hired me retired, and his successor was not very interested. And this problem of people not wanting to inherit, wanting to start their own stuff, I've encountered it in so many ways and in so many situations. That was the first time. But it's left me a bit bitter about OD. What they were going to do was the Likert type study. You measure attitudes and democratic type behaviour on a scale. You then have a change agent intervening in various ways, and then you measure again. And I know OD covers so many topics that one can't generalise, but the kind of OD which is about behavioural change, about making bad guys into good guys, was just fundamentally different from what we were trying to do. And I still don't like it. Stan Seashore was the head of this team. And I met him at a conference. And we were standing around sort of gossiping with a group of people. And I said that we'd spent 2 years fighting each other. And Stan said, "It would have been more fun if she hadn't been right." Which is very gracious. You know, I appreciate it. But it didn't undo the damage, because damage was done.
Do you think you could say a little bit more about why you are so against the OD approach? What is it between that approach and your approach that gets you going?
One thing is that it's only about behaviour, that it just isn't about structures, and it's called organisation, but it's only about the social system.
Okay.
It's not about, if you like, the socio-technical system. And the other is, I think it's just chutzpah to want to change somebody else's behaviour. Who am I to try to change your behaviour? Apart from the fact it doesn't work, I couldn't. I met a consultant who talked about he was an in-house consultant, and he talked about his hit list for paradigm change. As if, 3 today, another one tomorrow. I'm caricaturing it because I still feel some of that bitterness.
Do you think of it as the OD people being agents of management rather than of the whole system?
I wasn't thinking that. I mean, they've been accused of it. No, I don't think that.
Okay.
I think they quite often identify with the departments or populations they're working with. Someone, and I don't remember who it was, some eminent OD professional came and did a seminar which was about how the board had a policy which they worked through with the next level down, and everybody on the next level down did it with their subordinates, and so on, cascading all the way down. And it wasn't implemented until it had been worked through all the way down. And someone in the audience asked, but suppose it shouldn't be implemented? Suppose it's against somebody's interest? And he couldn't understand the question.
Yeah.
It's not that he had a pat answer for it, he couldn't understand it.
So, things wound down at ESSO.
Right. And there was a little interim episode which was quite funny, because they were not going to just ask me to leave. The idea was that they would ask me to work for them, but not from in-house, from outside. And the new employee relations manager and I explored a number of social science organisations where ESSO might place a contract and me.
Right.
And it was an interesting exercise, and it included talking to the Tavistock Institute. 3 of their senior people came to see us. That was Fred Emery and Hugh Murray and Hans van Beinum. And the conversation went well, and then my boss said, "Well, that's probably as far as we can get today. I'll be in touch. Who shall I write to?" And they looked at each other and said, "Oh, you can write to anybody." And Peter said, "Yes, all right, but who shall I write to?" And they said, "You can write to anybody."
Oh dear.
The whole thing collapsed. They were not willing to sort of compromise their ideals to the extent of giving a name. I then joined the TAVI, but without a contract from ESSO. And I was there for 19 years, and I won't plough through all that, but perhaps I could talk about a couple of streams of work. One was about the utilisation of the social sciences, which is still what I am, I think, centrally about. I wrote the essay book while I was in the TAVI with a grant from the SSRC, and it seemed to me that if you regard that as a detailed case study, the next step would be to compare it with others, because by then there were quite a lot of attempts of this kind going on. And Ken Eason and Ken was at Loughborough University and was seconded half-time to the TAVI. Ken Eason and I collected case studies in applied social science. And that took up a lot of time. And the book actually didn't come out till after I left, but that's very central to what I was about and what the later Bayswater Institute is about. And the other stream of work was about socio-technical work, job design and all that. I had two opportunities to contribute to the design of factories at the stage where operators were not there yet, so you couldn't use the experience of operators, which is what job redesign usually depends on.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really interesting, having to develop methods. And I did a lot of work in Germany, because in the 1970s, the German government had a major program about humanizing life at work.
Oh, yeah.
And I became a sort of consultant. The term is Gutachter, which is a kind of cross between a consultant, expert, witness. And I worked on that for 7 years or so, and learned a lot, because they had a different approach and much more related to the law and how can you formulate things that you can apply the law to and standards. It's very enriching and interesting experience, about which I also had a certain amount of ambivalence. And while all this was going on, one, of course, developed one's attitudes and ideas about the use of psychoanalysis. The idea that anyone working as a consultant needs to have an analysis was very well accepted in the social sciences. I think perhaps people now don't realise that, but already when I was with Joan Woodward, she said categorically, and she was not at all psychoanalytically inclined herself, that anyone who works as a consultant needs to have a personal analysis so that they can work on their own stuff somewhere and don't work on their own stuff on the back of the client. And I've had analysis, but there is another way of thinking, which is about you use it to interpret the client, and I'm a lot less confident about that. It's not that I never see what I think are unconscious dynamics going on and may voice it, but it's rare for me.
So where have you got to with your thinking now?
Well, I'm sorry, but some of it is where it always has been. That sounds arrogant, but yeah. If I look at it historically, the human relations movement started with the Hawthorne experiments and was a reaction against the human being in the system being irrelevant, not being noticed. But it went very quickly to the human being in the system being the only thing that was relevant, and all the other things not being noticed and being despised almost. And this reaction and counter-reaction goes on, and I'm still with the contingency approach and the psychodynamic approach, and how do they interact in a particular situation. I've never been so convinced about anything before, and perhaps not allowed myself to be. There are some things that puzzle me still, and I would love to do more work on. One is the question of when do wheels have to be reinvented and when do they not. There's an awful lot of reinventing of wheels, and some of it has to be. To me, it feels like we're doing too much of it, but I think it's worth looking at. Google has a lot to answer for. There is so much information. It is simpler to just start again from scratch, as if nothing had happened before, than to find out what happened before. Another thing that bothers me still is to what extent dependency is necessary for learning, and to what extent we overdo that. Because we enjoy people being dependent on us. And this whole guru culture, which affects our profession, I think, more than others. You find it in other professions too. But I think we overdo it. And it replicates itself, because if someone sees a generation having the privileges of gurus, they want to be gurus themselves. And it bothers me. I've been accused of not being enough of a guru, and I'm quite ambivalent about that. On the one hand, I'm quite pleased because I don't want to be. On the other hand, there may be some envy in that. Another thing that bothers me is where the value of experiential learning has turned into playing experiential parlour games. Sometimes I see experiential exercise going on which don't seem to have any bearing on anything. Now, a final thing, which is on perhaps a different dimension, there's been a real step change in the number of people and organisations working in this field. And that's changed the field. It's highly crowded and highly competitive. And the textbooks, the books we value, the people from whom we like to learn, they don't include that in what they teach us. So you may be excited about being asked to work on a problem and not realise that 4 other people have been asked to work on it as well. And for the enthusiastic young consultant or researcher, that's a hell of a discovery and a difficult thing to cope with. There was someone on the radio the other day talking about Haiti and saying, wouldn't it be better if there weren't so many small charities and aid agencies all wanting to make an impact? And that's the situation we're in. And we need to look at it. We need to not sweep it under the carpet. As long ago as the ESSO time, I had a section in that book called The Politics is Part of the Data. And the professional politics and competitiveness are part of the data we have to work with. And that should be part of the learning and teaching. I told you that I've written an autobiography. There are 2 images that keep cropping up, and it has a bit to do with my childhood and rather grounded parents. One is the image of a detective story. I loved detective stories. I still do. I'm hooked on Poirot and Miss Marple. And I do think a lot of the diagnostic stuff one is doing is like that. It's understanding, if it happened like that over there, does that mean that it's likely to be happening like this over here? And what would happen if you changed something up here? And what would be the consequences over there? And who will be affected? And how will they be affected? That's wonderful, and it's a detective story. And the other image that comes up again and again for me is cooking. The synthesis part, the developmental part of working with organisations seems to be very like cooking. I have enjoyed, if you like, institution building in the Bayswater Institute, and we need a bit more of that and a bit less of this, and you separate the eggs or you amalgamate them with oil and make the mayonnaise, and you give it a stir or you leave it to simmer. The difference is that you never get the meal. You're never bloody finished.
No. No.
and can say, now we can have some friends in and eat it,
Yeah.
because it's always incomplete.
Ah.
It doesn't have to make the time pass.
Lisl, thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you haven't been bored out of your mind.
Not at all. Thank you.
When I looked at that interview, I thought that, having talked about application of the social sciences and the psychodynamic approach to working with organisations, I ought to try to explore a bit how they relate to each other, or don't. This is about the use of knowledge on the one hand and the dynamics of engagement and action on the other. I never set out to be a consultant. What I've wanted was to find ways of making use of methods, concepts, approaches and findings of the social sciences, because they have a big contribution to make in dealing with industrial and organisational problems. To get that contribution made, one needed to learn about consultancy. But that, for me, was only a means to the end. In one direction, the issues between applied social science and a psychodynamic approach are about the role of evidence. Marie Yahoda pointed me in the direction of Robert Merton's chapter about manifest and latent functions in his book Social Theory and Social Structure. Latent functions are the unintended consequences, the things that happen as a result of arrangements without being motivated. She had a lovely example of this. A latent function of the British royal family is to increase Kodak sales. That was before digital photography, but never mind. One might find some unconscious or unacknowledged motivation on the part of the royal family, but I think it would be difficult. So how do you distinguish unintended consequences of that kind from unconscious defences, that is, motivated consequences? The answer is only by dint of evidence. To interpret something as an unconscious defence, you need to have some reason for saying that. I've always disliked interpretations which don't include some evidence, or which even show contempt for it, as sometimes happens. It may indeed just start with a strong feeling in the pit of my stomach, but if I work at it, I can usually find a reason for that feeling, and that reason can be shared. I really see no conflict between intuition and rigour. Incidentally, there is a lot in the psychoanalytic literature about defences against anxiety. I'm not aware of much discussion of defences against complexity. And I think that much of what we find to deplore in organisational life, for instance, bureaucratic or even authoritarian excesses, are in effect defences against complexity. Indeed, the splitting that I referred to between taking no account of the social system and taking only account of the social system, I would see as an example of a defence against complexity. So the question of respecting and acknowledging evidence is what needed to be worked at in one direction. In the other direction, where social scientists may fall short, I think there are two issues. The first is that research needs to be internalised and turned into use. You usually can't apply findings in a direct or immediate way, as it were, plonk them down. And the second issue lies in acknowledging and using transference. Harold Bridger confirmed my sense that understanding groups is a means, not an end, in working with organisations. But he also frequently said, you must use the transference. And that's been quite difficult for me to absorb, partly because I've seen a lot of abuse rather than use of the transference. So I tend to lean in the other direction. But partly also because research training teaches you to beware of Hawthorne effect and try to minimise it. It's a change of mode, not a move along a continuum. You have to switch in and out, and you have to take people with you as you do that. And of course, you don't always succeed. But I have a possibly naive feeling that if there is real intellectual and emotional work going on, things won't go too badly wrong.
I just wanted to add something along those lines.